You know, even a killer and a political thug like Russian President Vladimir Putin can be right. He gave a speech last week warning against the cancel culture and identity politics of the West. He said Russia had seen all this nonsense before with the communists destroying the culture.
Все это, как это, может быть, кому-то покажется неожиданным, мы в России уже проходили. У нас тут уже было. В большевики после революции 1917 года, опираясь на догмы марксизма Маркса и Энгельса, глядя на происходящее в ряде западных стран, мы с изумлением узнаем отечественные практики, которые сами, к счастью, оставили, надеюсь, в далеком прошлом. Борьба за равноправие и против дискриминации превращается в агрессивный догматизм на грани абсурда, когда великих авторов прошлого, того же Шекспира, перестают преподавать в школах и университетах. Потому что они, эти идеи, являются, как там считают, отсталыми. Классики объявляют отсталыми, не понимающими важности гендерного или расового вопроса.
Who knew that Putin was a Shakespeare lover? I suspect his favourite play must be Macbeth, all that killing of the opponents. And sure enough, the ABC, our supposedly national broadcaster, also last week showed exactly what Putin was warning about. It started with Q&A host Stan Grant asking perhaps our greatest Shakespearean actor, John Bell, why he didn't have an equal love for actually imaginary masterpieces that were never really written by Aborigines centuries ago, Aborigines who didn't actually have an alphabet.
You talked before about your introduction to Shakespeare and what grabbed you. The voices that are not heard here, the Iliads and the Odysseys that have been written here over 60,000 years. Did that not speak to you and Shakespeare did?
And then came the attacks on Shakespeare. First of all, he was too white, like the Europeans who added such glory to Western civilization.
But Shakespeare is used as the poster boy, right, for Western civilization being the best?
No, I don't agree with that. I'd say Michelangelo or Beethoven or, Van Gogh. I mean, you can take your pick about poster boys for Western civilization.
They're all white.
All white, oh, terrible. And then the leash was really off. Shakespeare was also a racist and a sexist.
I find when watching Shakespeare, like let's say something like Othello, for instance, you see these really gross representations of people of colour.
In Shakespeare, apparently only 17% of acts of speech are by women characters. Over 80% are by men.
And then Paul McDermott chipped in too, complaining that Shakespeare, yes, wrote only 70% of his speeches for women. Paul McDermott, whose big success was to star in the Doug Anthony All-Stars with not a single female performer. How about that? Joining me for Newswatch is Caleb Bond, journalist and columnist for the Herald Sun and the Adelaide Advertiser, and a Sky News contributor. Caleb, great to catch up with you again. Was Vladimir Putin right that the West is destroying itself with woke politics?
Yes, he is right. And he makes the point about the fact that the fight for equality has sort of turned into absurdity. And it's quite interesting to look at the change. I mean, you look at people who went to university in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a fight really for free speech. There was a fight for freedom of expression and to some degree freedom of the individual. And it was mostly pushed at that time by people of the left. They were trying to rebel against what they thought was a conservative regime or a conservative status quo at the time. What you now have is those same people, or not necessarily those same people. I mean, some of the old lefties still are of right mind, but the sort of younger kids who are going to uni now believe fundamentally in the same ideas of equality or whatever, but their way of going about it is to silence other people. It is to stop certain forms of speech. It is to remove individuals from public knowledge and public life because they say the wrong thing. The road that was paved by left-wingers of the past is now being torn up by left-wingers, supposedly in the name of the same fight that their ancestors took. And we have reached a point where the West is basically fighting itself and will fall in on itself if we continue down that road.
But it's also, this is so much based on sheer ignorance about the culture that has produced this glorious civilization. I mean, sheer ignorance. I mean, this idea that Shakespeare was a racist with characters like Othello, and they also mentioned in the show Shylock as well, a Jewish character. Is that actually true?
Well, no, and as Bell pointed out on Q&A, he having played Shylock before, and many Jewish actors having played Shylock as a Jewish character, and some people wrongly believe that the anti-Semitism that is displayed is somehow showing of Shakespeare's anti-Semitism, and that's not correct. I mean, what Shakespeare did through many of his plays, and we should also not forget his sonnets and the three long-form poems that he wrote, was he took themes that are eternal, which is why we still read and talk about and are influenced by Shakespeare today, but he took those themes of race and romance and tragedy and the like and used them to hold a mirror up to humanity. And so to display racism in a play is not to say that the playwright is racist. And this suggestion that Shakespeare was sexist, I mean, you know, he may well have been sexist. This was 400 years ago. You can't hold things of that era up to the same standard of today. We have to accept that there is some difference. And that question from Stan Grant to Bell about why, you know, he was more taken with Shakespeare than he was with any kind of Aboriginal art, which 60-odd years ago wasn't all that well known.
60,000 years ago.
You wouldn't ask that same question in the reverse. For instance, there was a great display of Albert Namatjira's art and his contemporaries and those who were influenced by him in the Queensland Art Gallery a couple of years ago. And it's one of the best art displays I've ever been to. Now, no one would ever ask me, why were you more taken with that art than you were with, say, Van Gogh? Because it sets it up, it's a race-baiting question. It sets it up as either or,
yeah, well,
and it's not an either or situation.
I'm a Van Gogh nut, so don't you start putting artists above Van Gogh with me.
Oh, no.
Othello's actually... In Othello, the real villain is a white guy, Iago. Othello's portrayed as the victim of racism, for a start, and Shylock is also portrayed as a victim of racism. And it's just so obscene that these idiots think, oh, well, no, it's exactly the opposite. Plus, most of his sonnets, as you well know, were written to express his love for a man.